Tātou, ki te kaupapa tēnei rā, ara ko ngā mahi i waiho ki te kōwhi uri, me ki ko te COVID-19, me wera wana mahi e pāna ki tērā kaupapa. Nō reira nā ki tērā, kia koutou katoa, huri no te motu, tēnā koutou, kia ora hui hui mai tātou katoa. Kia ora tātou, given the rare privilege actually of coming here today to chair the occasion tonight, I'm very pleased to hear that we have some very, very, very good presenters that are given some time to this kaupapa to spend with us to toha whakaaro, toha mātauranga hoki kia mōhio wai mātou te nako o te kaupapa nei. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, kia ora hui mai tātou. Ko te tānata tuatahi e kōrero atu nei tēnei pō, ko Ngaire. Ngaire is a core member of STIR. She's here today to do a basic breakdown of the kaupapa initially so that we can open up the kōrero for our other esteemed guests, and Dr. Rawiri, McKee-Jansen, and also Polly Atatoa, Carr. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what these people have to say. This is not about me, so I want to hand over the microphone at this point to you, Ngaire. If you could start us off with this kaupapa, that would be great. Kia ora.
Tēnā koe, Trevor, tēnā koe mō tō karaka I tēnei pō, me mihi mai oha kia koutou katoa. Kia ora everybody. As Trevor says, yes, I'm a member of STIR, and I'm just going to do a really little kind of overview around the Haumaru report so that Rawiri and Polly don't have to spend their time going over the basics, and just to give us all a bit of a background around that. So just before I get into that, you'll see on the screen we are borrowing the beautiful community guidelines from Te Tiriti Based Futures, just about our kaupapa for how we're going to operate our webinar I tēnei pō. And just to let you know that we are recording this, as there are some people that aren't able to join us tonight. So just so that you're aware of that, and just, yeah, acknowledgement to you, Trevor. Thanks for holding the kaupapa for us as we go through this, and to Rawiri and Polly. So it just occurred to me that it's kind of, we didn't plan this obviously, but it's ironic, is it? I don't know if irony is the word, but it's ironic that we're doing this today, only 24 hours since the government basically abandoned the public health approach to COVID-19. And I'm sure Rawiri and Polly will have some more things to say about that. But just the Haumaru report came out as a result of the Waitangi Tribunal inquiry. Claimants, the New Zealand Māori Council, asked the tribunal to inquire into aspects of the Crown's response to COVID-19, and a priority hearing was held just before Christmas last year. The inquiry covered regard to the numbers of Māori vaccination rates and COVID-19 cases, particularly is the Crown's vaccination strategy and plan consistent with Te Tiriti and its principles? Is the Crown's November 2021 COVID-19 protection framework consistent with Te Tiriti o Waitangi and its principles? And what changes are required to ensure the Crown's vaccination strategy and protection framework are Tiriti compliant? And just before we go any further, I just wanted to have a little bit of a kōrero about a word about the language that's used. The tribunal report uses the language of and refers to treaty principles. And just to be clear, the STIR position is that Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the Māori text, is the authoritative text, and to refer to articles, not principles. But throughout the tribunal report, there is a reference to the treaty, te tiriti, and principles. So, for example, the Crown talks about tino rangatiratanga as not absolute and unqualified. And the Crown is not required to go beyond what is reasonable in the prevailing circumstances. What is reasonable is thus context specific and may change. And I'm sure many of us would say that that's not a definition of tino rangatiratanga that sits well. So just to keep that in mind, that the following slides are in regards to the language from the tribunal report. So they found that the approach breached the vaccination strategy, breached te tiriti in regards to data. And of course, this kind of affirmed what came out in Y2575, and the Crown is acknowledging that it still does not collect data relevant to Māori health sufficiently, and that they did not collect sufficient data accurately and equitably to inform the rollout of the vaccine for Māori, and particularly tangata whaikaha, which is in breach of treaty principles of active protection and equity. The further breach in regards to the vaccination strategy was specifically around the age-based adjustments to the vaccine rollout. So there was a need to have some kind of prioritisation. However, officials did advise the Crown that the vaccine strategy should include age adjustment for Māori to account for the younger age of Māori population and lower life expectancy. However, the Cabinet declined to include this adjustment. Cabinet's decision to reject advice from its own officials to adopt an age adjustment for Māori in the age-based vaccine rollout breached the treaty principles of active protection and equity. There was further treaty breaches in regards to the COVID-19 protection framework, and here you can see, I won't read all that out for you, but that they found the several treaty breaches in terms of how the COVID-19 protection framework puts Māori at disproportionate risk of Delta infection, puts Māori health and whānau order providers under extreme pressure, and was made despite strong and unanimous opposition by Māori, which is in breach of the principle of partnership. The tribunal found in regards to engagement with Māori that, again, that they breached the principle of partnership. And I think, you know, here when they say further, the nature of its engagement was often one-sided and as a result sometimes disrespectful. And also the finding that there was prejudice to Māori, and this is directly from the report. In effect, the lack of adequate protection for Māori afforded by the COVID-19 protection framework is the prejudice that has resulted from Cabinet's earlier decision to reject an age-adjusted vaccine rollout. And finally, just, I'm not, again, won't read through all of these, but these were the final kind of tribunal recommendations. So as STIR, we were conscious that, you know, the report for Haumaru came out just before Christmas last year, and we seem as a country to have been just getting on with it, and a lot of what came out within the tribunal recommendations may not have been adequately publicised, discussed and reported. And so the idea of the webinar tonight is to make sure that we are really cognizant of these recommendations, and for us as a sector to raise awareness of this and to consider how we might go forward with these recommendations in mind. And just the final thing from me is that we're really encouraging pātai and kōrero from you all, and but that's all I wanted to do, is just kind of give us a basic overview of what the Haumaru report said. And of course, I'll leave the expert commentary and whakaaro to Rawiri and Polly. So, ngā mihi, kia ora.
Ngā mihi kia koe anoho ki Ngaire. Ngā mihi kia koe mo tō whakatūwheratanga o te kaupapa. Kia tau ai te kaupapa, kia mōhio ai tātou te kaupapa mo tēnei pō. Ko tō tātou kai kōrero tuarua, ko Dr. Rawiri McKee-Jansen, no Ngāti Raukawa, e pā anō hoki ki Ngāti Hinerangi. I kita anō ahau te tini o ngā reta, kei mua tōna ingoa. Engari, you know, he brings such a wonderful resource and wonderful acumen to this kōrero tonight. We have bios here. I think everyone has them available to them anyway. But just to reiterate the acumen that Rawiri brings to this kōrero tonight, a stunning history of experience that he brings to this kōrero. So you don't want to be listening to me. If you want to have a look at the bio, you'll see just how stunning it is and how wonderful, you know, the wonderful length and depth of service that he's brought to this kaupapa and other kaupapa in terms of hauora. So without further ado, I'll hand the rākau over to Rawiri. Kia ora, Rawiri.
Kia ora. Tēnā koe, Trevor. Mātia o. Ka mihi kia koe, o tira kia koutou o stir e tiaki nei tēnei kaupapa, te hauora ngai tātou, te pakanga ki tērā kaikiri, nō reira ka mihi tēnā koutou. Yeah, hey, thanks for having me. Sorry I was late. Sorry about that. I had to get home in the Auckland traffic jam. If it rains in Auckland, there's a traffic jam. Just saying. People can't drive at their normal speed because it's wet. Anyway. Interesting, eh? One of the things I really liked about the report was how they named it Haumaru, and that fits really nicely with the first report, the report from stage 1 of the tribunal inquiry into health services and outcomes. And so that, I mean, the kaupapa inquiry is 2575, and the first report comes out and it's hauora, beautiful. And I'm sure you've all read it. And so this report comes out and it's Haumaru. And so there's a nice connection in what they're doing. So I want to locate the conversation, I guess, first of all, by thinking about where we got to with the stage 1 report into health services and outcomes. And so one way into that is Ngaire was talking about the difference between thinking about tiriti, the articles, and tiriti, the principles. But, you know, 20 years ago, if people asked you about the principles, a lot of people would say the 3 Ps. And now, if you tried to run the 3 Ps, you're going to get slapped down. Partnership, protection, participation. And so the Hauora report really took apart the idea of participation. And, you know, the tribunal had defended that for decades. Go right back to the Napier Hospital tribunal inquiry. And so this tribunal really sort of graciously said, well, tried it with good intentions, but participation didn't go anywhere. So let's upgrade that. And so we end up with those 5 principles. You know, we've got to place that into a context too. There's no way there's 5 principles. So I get where Stur's coming from saying, you know, principles isn't the way to do this, because who gets to say what the principles are? And you end up in this massive battle where the Crown's resource to determine for themselves what they think the principles are. And so Ngaire also kind of noticed that with respect to tino rangatiratanga, according to the Crown version of it, is limited, and so on and so on. But anyway, so Haumaru came out with tino rangatiratanga, principle of tino rangatiratanga, principle of equity, principle of options, principle of partnership, and principle of active protection. So when you look at the health services and outcomes kaupapa inquiry, it occurs in a context when we've kind of got through most of the classic tribunal claims, which are location-based and iwi or hapu-based. Still working on ngāpui, obviously, but you know, we don't have time to go into that one tonight. So most of those sort of classic kind of claims have been have gone through, had settlements and stuff like that. And so the tribunal itself sort of grouped up all the remaining 800 odd claims and whatever and set her up. They look like they form into these kind of theme-based inquiries. And so health was the third one, but the biggest one, you know, biggest cab off the rank. And so I worked for, at the time I worked for the National Haumaru Coalition, and that was claim 1315, and I was lead claimant for the Māori Medical Practitioners Association 2499. And you know, one of the clashes between the organisation I worked for and the group that I was named lead claimant for was that Māori medical practitioners were really saying it's important to look at health services, and if you want to understand health outcomes, you have to look way beyond health services. And so we have to look into loss of land and loss of language and loss of rongoa, and we have to look at housing and employment and education and corrections and justice and police, and I could go on. But you know, we kind of eloquently did that in our submission, in our statement of claim, and we contested whether or not the tribunal should divide it into doing a stage 1 priority hearing into primary care, which is where they decided to go. So, you know, the organisation I'm working for, with also a very good compelling claim about health services and outcomes, got privileged and elevated in the journey. So we're still in this kaupapa inquiry, you know, the disability and mental health, and there's more to come. So I want to kind of locate this conversation in which we ended up with another priority hearing about COVID and protection and breach into that bigger context. And I think also want to notice the context of Māori data sovereignty. And so, you know, depending on how the conversation goes tonight, we might want to unpack that conversation and look at that, because that is relevant in the Haumaru report. And I'll just stay in the tribunal space for one more minute, is thinking about the Murihuku report years ago. It's one of the earliest reports. It's not Y1, but it's Y fucking small number, right? So it might be in the first 10 or something. And I don't know how many of you read that, but what I really enjoyed about it, so judge was Tai Hakure jury, and it was one of the biggest reports early, right? One of the biggest inquiries early. And he was putting together all of these threads, and he's made this really strong, compelling toda from it. And so I was reflecting on that as we were getting ready for the this priority claim, which I wasn't a witness in, but I just supported some of the claimants in terms of accessing expert witnesses and stuff. Anyway, so I'm looking at the Murihuku report, and to break it down into kind of a parable rather than a legal document, part of what he did was he was able to describe that a hapu and Trevor will be sitting there imagining exactly the same thing. You think of a hapu and they can describe the kind of geographic landmarks of their influence and their boundary and their control and their mana. And so from this headland here to this bluff over here, that's the hapu. We've got control over that, and we can describe fishing grounds off this bay that are used at this certain time of year, or certain rules about how you fish from here and when you can and when you can't, and so on and so on. And when he came down to it, Tai Hakare Jury was saying the power to say no. So the power to say no is tino rangatiratanga. When you can determine who can come to this bay, for what purpose, and how they can do their business, that is a sovereign power that this hapu has and exercises. And it seemed to me especially relevant when we think about what happened when COVID came, that many hapu, many communities exercised the power to say no. They were called road blockades, or they were iwi information points or whatever, but it was a powerful way of Māori communities and hapu exercising their rangatiratanga, the power to say no. So that's what I want to sort of say in terms of the tribunal stuff directly. And then we get down into some of the details, and we had this really robust contestation about the age adjustment. And so, at the time, I go back because I was in the immunisation implementation advisory group, and to the extent that we can, we want to bring science to these complex, difficult decisions. And so there's going to be a prioritisation of the vaccine rollout, and just simply doing it based on age, anybody over the age of 75, anybody over the age of 65, anybody, if you do that, it's deeply harmful to Māori, because we're going to be exposed to the impact of COVID at a much greater rate, because more of us are living in South Auckland and working in places where our risk of getting it is higher. Our risk of getting it is high because we're also exposed to the risk of having household crowding, and all of these risks are known. And so, I was relying on some of the stuff that Pūnaha Matatini had produced, and they had a report we had, try and work through. It was pre-publication, and who's, how do you get it peer reviewed and how do you use it? Because we don't have perfect information. We don't have perfect data. We don't have perfect data analysis. We've got some stuff, and we want to use the science to inform the best approach. And the Pūnaha Matatini paper was essentially saying, and later on it got, it was adopted and, goes through the peer review, and it was all good. But essentially what it was saying was that a Māori man aged 44 with no comorbidities had the same risk of impact from COVID that a Pākehā man aged 65 with no comorbidities would have. So that's the size of the inequity gap. And for Pacific men, it was 25 years was the gap. And it was interesting to me, and I didn't want to round it out. I'm going, people go, well, we'll just make it 20 years. No, fuck off. Here's this ugly reality. I want people to be uncomfortable about the ugly reality of it. The science, to the best of the ability of this group that's doing the analysis, says it's 21 years and 25 years. I'm not interested in discounting that to try and make somebody feel better or whatever. Let's run with the science. And so that was one of the battles. And then, of course, Cabinet decided not to do any age adjustment and rolled out a program which was, breach of the treaty, hell yeah, but it was harmful to Māori. And so to give you a sense of the harm that was caused by that, it is because we were delayed in the vaccination rollout, we were exposed to the greatest misinformation. So if you go to Kate Hanna and the Disinformation Project team, you see that the peak of disinformation was in July of that year. And we had not had the rollout reach the bulk of our population. So we were marinated in disinformation in a way that was harmful for our communities. In the end, we reached what I said at the beginning was the predicted we would exceed 90% of vaccinations, but the journey to get there was much longer and much harder and required much more effort from Māori providers and Māori communities than we should have had. And so, yes, it's true, officials put the information up to Cabinet, but I do think somebody could interrogate just the phraseology that's used when you put information up to Cabinet, because, here's you should do it with an age adjuster. Actually, I think you had to do the age adjustment required is this uncomfortably big number because we have a racist health system, and not doing the age adjuster is racist. It's how do we tone police ourselves by going, oh, it's a 20-year gap or whatever. And I don't want to do that. I want to be bluntly frank with how bad this is. I want to name it when it's racism. And I think a failure to do that is one of the ways in which we don't get this job done. There you go. Okay, Rawiri.
Kia ora, Rawiri. We don't have questions as yet, but I'm sure they're going to come eventually. But kia ora for your kōrero. On that note, and given what you've said, it's a really interesting opening to this discussion. Thank you very much to both you and Ngaire. At this point, we're going to go straight to Polly. Polly's asked that I don't read out her bio as well, but nevertheless, Polly is a public health physician, and with that kind of background, I think she's going to bring a wealth of information to this kōrero. And rather than read out your bio, Polly, that's something that you might load at this point, I'll just hand it over to you to start talking to us all. Kia ora.
Kia ora koutou. Tangi ke te matakaina nei runga I te whapō o te manaroa. Me a waiki tua ki a waiki tautau te aka inua tangata o tērā motu o tērā inua. Tai mai ki Aotearoa tangi ke rawa. Tēnei te mihi ki a koe Trevor mō tō karakia, tō mihi whakatau me te whakatuwhera te kaupapa o tēnei pō. Ana mihi mahana ki a tātou kai whakahaere. O tēnei hui Ngaire, tēnā koe te rangatira Rawiri, ko Polly Atatoa ka tōku ingoa, he tākutu ahau, he kairanga hau ahau, he māma ahau, nō reira tēnā koutou, tēnā rā tātou katoa. Thanks very much, that was fabulous, and I'm marinating myself in all sorts of ideas, and let me see if I can try and insert some of that wisdom into some of my kōrero, as well as recognise the wonderful Te Tiriti-based futures kaupapa that you put up early, Ngaire. I wrote down, no one knows everything, quite pleased about that statement, because I'm not exactly sure why I'm the other panelist in this kaupapa. We can't be articulate all the time, also quite keen on that one, and we don't take ourselves too seriously, so quite keen to make sure that I bring that flavour to this kōrero this evening, but thank you very much for the invitation and to contribute. I'm a non-Māori academic working here at the University of Waikato in Te Ngaire, our Institute of Population Research. I was in a position to support the COVID response on secondment into the Ministry of Health, into a strategic response team at around about the time that this Haumaru process was happening, and in the kind of year preceding that. and I've kind of had 15 odd years or more working in public health, really with a passion for health equity and equity of outcomes. I'm not Pacific, but I am the mother of Ngaian children and the grandmother of a brand new Ngaian Samoan mokopuna. So that's also a lens, I guess, that I experience and that I bring to my kōrero today. And I'm really privileged to have spent a lot of my career learning from my Māori and Pacific colleagues and communities, including Rawiri and many of others, names that I recognise around our virtual tepu here. So I really wanted to ground what I say, which is my personal opinion, in that positionality, I guess. I'm also perhaps a little bit outdated for this kōrero. It was actually really interesting to reread some of the stuff that I've written and jotted down in my trusty red notebooks here over the last couple of years, to think about this, because I'm not working in this space formally at the moment at all. I tend to think in threes. There's a few of you here in our rōpū that know me quite well and know that I don't have a particularly good memory, so I tend to be able to remember three things. So I've kind of thought about three areas that I thought it would be good maybe to stimulate some pātai and some kōrero this evening, and some of them map quite nicely onto the wonderful kōrero that we've just heard from Rawiri. And I guess I was thinking, I'm quite excited about public health being both an art and a science. And for me, the intersection between the art and the science of public health is the context of our kōrero and the context of our communities. So for me, actually, one of the most important chapters of Haumaru was the chapter that's actually called Context. That's chapter 2, but also the treaty obligations in chapter 3. Because even though not much of that, if any, makes its way into the final recommendations or even into the sort of executive summary, for me, that's the gold. And a lot of it is the science that Rawiri's just mentioned, but also the work of many others providing really clear information as a backdrop to Haumaru. So that was absolutely that our Māori and Pacific populations, I'm sitting here in a demographic institute. These populations are very youthful populations with more than 25% of the population aged under 12. Median age is, 15, 16 years younger for Māori compared to European, and even younger still for Pacific. We know, as Rawiri has just mentioned, that there's not only an overburden of risk factors for disease severity when we're thinking about COVID in our Māori and Pacific populations, but also for high transmission. So the experience of severe housing deprivation and overcrowding, the working in our essential industries, and the experience of poverty and general material deprivation, and also the high responsibilities in voluntary work and in looking after communities and whānau. We already knew all of that before we even had our first case. We also already knew, and the kaupapa inquiry looking at primary care and the Haumaru report, as Rawiri's mentioned, has also very clearly documented the significant inequities already experienced in our Māori and Pacific populations, and the breaches of Te Tiriti that have resulted in those inequities. And the mechanism whereby those inequities have occurred through colonisation, through systems failures, through racism, etc. We already knew all of that as well also before we had our first case. So I think that this this context is really important, and it's sort of buried a little bit in Haumaru. And also we knew, and the reason why, which is a fabulous thing, the reason why we ended up being able to have this rapid and urgent inquiry system for the tribunal, we knew that there was real strength in our Māori providers, and in the group that called for this inquiry. We knew that Māori leadership, Māori power, decision-making, tino rangatiratanga, etc. We knew that that was the way, with clear monitoring and accountability, that was the way to reverse some of our inequities and achieve equity. We knew that before we had our first case as well. So I just think it's important to start with that, even when we look at the detail of Haumaru, to think about even prior to Delta, prior to even there being Pfizer developing a vaccination, prior to the program, to the focus areas of Haumaru, there was already evidence and understanding and historical precedent that recognised what would happen if Māori were not prioritised. And this kind of overarching, you know, like the reverse of the magnet, whenever you think about anyone tried to talk about Māori prioritisation, it's this kind of force field of discontent, I guess. So the result was predictable. And I guess part of me thinks, yes, it's great to have the inquiry, but it's disappointing that we have to have the inquiry, I guess, is the sort of context that I started to think about when I was reading through this again. And then my second point situated kind of within the Haumaru report, and I again was really interested in locating it within the broader Y2575 and recognising that Y2575 is not just about health services, but also about outcomes, and how cool that is, because it's taken us a long time to even be able to talk about equity of outcomes rather than just equity. And the of outcomes is really, really important. As Ngaire picked up earlier, I was kind of fascinating, and you know, this is probably partly because it's really outside my area of expertise, around the kōrero of treaty principles and standards as they had been established in the broader hauora process. For example, in Chapter 3, and Rawiri's picked up on these, I was really interested in the discussion in Haumaru about the Crown's treaty obligations and how they could potentially be moderated by specific circumstances, like moderated when the Crown is needing to act under urgency, or moderated when there's a national health crisis. But the discussion in the tribunal report in Haumaru talks quite clearly around how in the circumstances of COVID, it's actually important for the Crown to have intensified their actions towards fertility responsiveness rather than to you know, negatively moderate them. And again, I don't think that kind of recognition of the need for intensification is brought through in any of the recommendations or in any of the activities that have stemmed from the process, if there are any. And that's a real pity, because what we do see, and this is my experience in the health system, in Crown agencies, at a time of crisis, is we actually see this reverting to the norm, or reverting to our practices, which often don't intensify our fertility responsiveness. In fact, they revert back to the, you know, one size fits all. We've just got to get on and get something done. You know, let's kind of the low-hanging fruit type approach. So I think that intensification requirement is something that's a really interesting point of Haumaru, specifically talking about enhanced support for tino rangatiratanga, for example, enhanced focused on prioritisation of Māori lives and hauora Māori. And of course, along with that becomes the challenging corridor around power sharing and resourcing. Then the other principle that's fascinating to me, but maybe again this is because I'm a bit stupid, is the principle of options. It's like options is a principle, and I must admit that my most recent secondment in the Ministry of Health also really had this real struggle with that word options, because when you're writing cabinet paper, you have to have this options section in the template, right? And so in my mind, options is a really challenging word when we think about equity, because I think about options as gives you a get out of jail free clause. Options gives you an opportunity to blame something else or somebody else's decision making for the outcome, because all you did was provide the options. It's up to them to decide which option to take. And in the cabinet papers that I've been most recently involved in, the options were just stupid, because you can't actually do any of the options, but you have to put the options in because the template requires you to have the options. So I'm really interested in this corridor about options, and I might have kind of got it wrong. But you know, that area for me in Haumaru is really interesting, because I'm quite nervous about the languaging. You were talking about languaging earlier, and I'm quite nervous about that, and how that allows us to kind of water down our responses. And where am I? Getting myself confused. The last point regarding the kind of report itself, which relates to that kind of options, I think, and also relates to Rawiri's awesome conversation around the kind of free and frank advice that's provided by our kind of policy peeps. And so Haumaru got me thinking about Crown decision making. Because I think some of that is not clear in a lot of the tribunal processes and recommendations, because there's different parts of the agencies that are Crown agencies that have different roles and responsibilities towards decision making. So there's those that have the responsibility for providing free and frank advice or expert advice. Then there's those that have the responsibility for making decisions, and they're not necessarily the same people. And what I think I agree with Rawiri absolutely about here is this kind of this gap between the provision of that advice and the decision making, and the reliance, what I read, particularly in the Crown's response in Haumaru, was, oh, well, we did lots of consultation, and, expert advisors are providing evidence for X, Y, and Z, but actually this is not an engagement process. This is not power sharing. This is not co-design. This is not governance or decision making or partnership, because this is much more of a kind of, it's not even really a one-way street. It's like this really complicated, like Parisian roundabout, and you just don't know who's got on and who's going to get off. And it's really tricky to be a civil servant in that space. It's also really tricky to be an expert advisor, and to be a expert advisor from a Māori or Pacific community, where you're kind of inserting this information into that roundabout, and you never know whether you're going to see it again or what it's going to look like when you do. And so I think it's quite important not to oversimplify that policy translation process and not to oversimplify the provision of evidence into that process, and therefore how it needs to be so much better. And then my final point really was kind of coming back to what you started us with, Ngaire, and that's about, okay, so what then? You know, the Haumaru report, as you said, came out just before the rollout of the vaccination for the pediatric ages. You know, what did we learn from that process? What have we put into practice now? Because we haven't finished the job. COVID response, yeah, we might have lost the protection framework at midnight last night, but we haven't finished responding to COVID. So what's happening now? And I think there's a bit in Haumaru that says, well, the statistics speak for themselves, and they most absolutely do. So the statistics that I was sent, or that I looked at today, the age standardized Māori hospitalisation rate for COVID is 1.7 times European and other. Māori are also 1.7 times more likely to die from COVID compared to other ethnic groups. Pacific are 2.8 times more likely to die. I understand that still we only have 83% of Māori aged 12 plus vaccinated against COVID with the full primary course. So we still actually haven't reached the 90% threshold that we were supposed to reach before we changed the protection framework. Not 89% of Pacific. Tamariki under 12 have appalling completed COVID vaccination rates, less than 20%. Booster coverage for Māori is approximately half the population. And of course, we still see this huge inequitable burden in health outcomes. And that's not just non-COVID outcomes, that's outcomes that are really related to COVID, because they're around childhood immunisation, for example, and planned care delivery, and preventative care delivery. So, you know, cancer diagnosis, etc. So not only did these statistics indicate that the recommendations of Haumaru haven't been put into action, there also remains a really important need to have this data to intelligence, evidence, and data sovereignty corridor, because that hasn't been fixed either. There remains this incredibly significant burden on our Māori providers and our Māori communities, and our Pacific providers and our Pacific communities, who not only are continuing to respond, but they've also stood up this brand new workforce. And now, at least in the Waikato, what they are doing is thinking, okay, how do we make sure that that workforce is continuing to keep our Māori and Pacific communities well and alive in a sustainable way, to prove that even though they might not now be specific COVID response units, they are still integral to an effective health system. So again, our Māori and Pacific providers trying to be really innovative and effective without that kind of governance or necessarily resource support. And the recent developments, obviously, in the health sector and the transformation also provide really important opportunities. So the Pai Ora Healthy Futures Act, for example, strengthening our legislative obligations in this space. But I think they also provide additional challenges to Te Tiriti responsiveness. If we look at all the different organisations, and this might be something, Rawiri, that would be really interesting to hear your kōrero around. But the increasing on organisations, and again, the kind of lack of clarification around roles and decision making, and who's the monitoring organisation, and where's the accountability, and how does intelligence contribute to that, and how are there partnership arrangements and decision making in those processes. We certainly, at least to my mind, we haven't landed any of that yet, and we know, well, I think that in these times of kind of ongoing exhaustion and crisis, we again sort of revert to type. So I guess I started with thinking, awesome, but what a pity. we needed to have this tribunal hearing, and I would hate to think that we'll need another one to talk about the loss of the protection framework at midnight last night, or the measles epidemic because of our childhood immunisation rates, or whatever is sort of, you know, next coming towards us. But once again, ngā mihi nui ki a koutou katoa, tangi ke, looking forward to the pātai and the ongoing kōrero. Kia ora.
Kia ora maura, Polly. Thank you very much for a very insightful presentation tonight. Lots of very interesting insights there that you provided for us, the viewers today. At this point, I think we're going to open up for Q&A for both Rawiri and Polly. I haven't seen any questions come up in the chat. Is there anybody amongst our kaiwhakahaere who have a question?
Yeah, I got a question. I'd like to ask Rawiri, what do you think of what Polly said? Oh, good question. So, because that is the additional thing, is we place it into that context of Delta, and Delta, you know, reaching into our poorest, most vulnerable, most overcrowded, brownest communities, reliant on the cash economy, and all the stigma that we had, you know, critique of people getting COVID. And we, in Auckland, we virtually closed down every household of Delta. We got bloody close to it. You know, we were into single digits. And I was at a conference to the GPs, and I said, you guys, it was in Christchurch, you guys got Christmas because we did Delta. So, and then the other thing that you made me think of, Polly, was, you know, one of the key issues in the claimant's position was about getting access to data. But it's incredibly complex. I know the claimants wanted to make it quite simple, give us the data, it's our data. But, you know, I had lots of Māori colleagues who were saying, why would I share my data with my iwi? My iwi's not doing health services for me in whatever city I live in. Why would my data be shared with whānau water agencies? I haven't given permission for that. And, you know, it's got to have this really deep understanding. I mean, we've failed in our data collection really badly. Our ethnicity data, we've failed in the statistics. You know, that last census, 35,000 Māori were missing in the census, or, you know, it was Gisborne. Sorry, everybody, Gisborne's disappeared. You compare HSU to NHI, again, there's 30, 40,
more than
50,000.
100% of Pacific in HSU for some strange reason, which I can't work out.
So we've got this shit data system.
Yeah.
And, you know, so that's part of that context. And yes, there's a breach of the treaty, but now it's this complex piece of work actually has to happen. I have to help Polly understand what options means. Okay, we've got some work to do. Right. You know, people should be typing their questions in. I know you fellas, I know lots of you fellas. Type your bloody questions in.
Just while we're waiting, what's both of your responses to the ending of the COVID protection framework?
Yeah, never really liked the traffic light thing. Traffic lights fuck me off all the time. I'm living in Auckland. I've been 20 years in Auckland. Orange means speed up, you know. Red, orange, green, yeah, okay. So there's no doubt we need protection frameworks. There's no doubt we need to be able to talk to communities and populations about what protection looks like. There's no doubt we've got to have rules and settings. I mean, I'm old, right? I've in all my working career, I've worked with nurses who were required to be vaccinated. You couldn't start your first week at nursing school unless you were vaccinated. So I got no problem with mandates. We've got to do mandates. We've got to have some mandates, Jesus. So the rest of it becomes making the right decisions about what those mandates are, making the right decisions about what the protections are, i.e. ask the right questions. Who are we protecting? How are we protecting people? All right, now we've got an understanding of it. And now we have to communicate that to communities. It has to make sense to communities. And so apparently that'll just be Ashley and Jacinda. Well, I mean, I gave them good advice too. I said, I rang up Ashley. It was his first weekend off during the whole COVID thing. I thought, oh, sorry. When he came back off leave, he said, oh, good on you for having a weekend off. Well done. Yeah, he worked hard. But I said, you're making a mistake. It shouldn't be you standing up on that bloody podium every day. You have to get Caroline McElnay on that podium. It has to be a team. You know, you want to tell me it's a team of 5 million or whatever. I want to see a team approach to what we're doing there. Are you going to run this whole thing and not have Māori? You're not going to have anybody else standing up there. You're the Director General of Health. You've got work to do. You've got to go and work with corrections and police and, you know, go and work with all those other fuckers. And you get your Director of Public Health on there doing this stuff. But, you know, it wasn't welcomed greatly. But, you know, it was within a couple of days of that he did get Caroline up to have a turn. But, you know, so how we've got to do the science of the protection framework, and then we've got to do a good job of making sure, you know, everybody's well communicated with and understands it and feels they're part of it. Anyway, over.
Polly, you got anything to follow on?
No, I mean, I guess for me, you know, it's a public health framework, so it needs to be scientific and evidence-based, but it also needs the art and the nuance. And so that's the challenge that we have with a, you know, kind of national framework with traffic lights and levels and grades that nobody understands, and different situations in different places, when actually what's missing is the prioritization of equity of outcomes. So continuing on with the protection framework wasn't going to achieve equity. And that's what I'm interested in. That's the outcome I'm interested in supporting. But I guess it will be really interesting to see how we can adapt an exhausted system to manage the nuance and the intensification of Te Tiriti responsiveness required.
I see we have a question from Ebony Cormier. Ebony, I couldn't really make what your question was heading towards. If you're online, would you mind asking your question?
Kapai, sorry. I was just a question or just a statement about thoughts of, you know, active protection for Māori and Pacifica in the media, because seeing that out there, it was a tough time, and the comparisons between non-Māori and Māori and the vaccination rates, it seemed quite stark and quite hurtful almost for myself being Māori. But I just wondered, you know, where was the active protection of Māori and Pacifica in the media at that time, or what your thoughts are?
Any takers?
Yeah. So we get hammered, eh? We get portrayed. We get talked about. Yeah. Hell yeah. But that isn't. It's an interesting provocation, Ebony, because the part that we can own inside the system, or the bit that I go, well, actually, Te Whatuora, Ministry of Health, Health New Zealand, Crown agencies, your responsibility, your duty, all of that stuff. And then outside that, in the media space, there's not much of a Crown responsibility presence, eh? I can do the odd complaint to Radio New Zealand or something like that. I'll do the odd complaint about media outlets. But the Broadcasting Standards Authority doesn't have, you know, a Tiriti informed framework at all. So you're up against it. Sorry, it was distressing, and there's no clear fix for that. Over.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, Ebony, and I guess I'm interested in the monitoring and accountability per se. I'm not so sure that we do have it right in even the health sector organisations, let alone the media. So yeah, I think that's a really important discussion. I don't have an answer.
Ngā mihi.
Kia ora, Ngaire. Kate, were there any other questions that people had out there?
There's a couple of comments in the chat. There's a comment there from Lisa, but there's also there's a bit of a comment from Julia as well as a question. I think Julia's still online, I think, so maybe Julia wanted to put that. Are you still there, Julia? If you're there, maybe you wanted to put that directly to Rawiri and Polly.
Kia ora, Ngaire, and yeah, thanks for that opportunity. I'm just really mindful at the moment, I guess, that we look back and see all the things that have happened and need to, you know, continue to hold people to account, including myself. But what I'm seeing right now is also the active dismantling of the things that have been set up, that have been iwi mandated, that have been pro-equity, that have been reaching, you know, marginalised whānau who were never engaged before. And yet now the COVID money stopping, there's a sort of a sense that, you know, oh, well, it's all over now. It's not just the dismantling of the traffic lights, it's actually the, you know, the dismantling of that whole infrastructure and that whole way of working, that Manaaki first, all of that is, yeah, how do we work collectively across the networks to actively maintain as much of that, to, you know, to carry on, not just about COVID, but for all the other issues that we need to manage.
It's kind of rhetorical. Julia's not asking me, she's asking all of you to reflect and consider. And you know, so this is a bit of work we've got to do pretty much immediately. And so my first response is, I was doing some work with a friend recently about methamphetamine addiction treatment, and she's interested in doing some work supporting hapu mama with methamphetamine addictions. So it's got nothing to do with COVID, I'm just saying. This is an interesting response, but we're at some hui and they started talking about the proceeds of crime funding. And when you look at the harms impacted on communities from methamphetamine, and then the police curiously wait until it's a big issue rather than a little issue. They won't shut down a little tinny shop selling methamphetamine. They'll wait months and months and months, you know, 6 months or more. They'll wait until it's a big operation, and so they can go after these big bad, you know, so the whole commercialization of this addiction, it's got to be really big, and then they close it down, they go after it and they get some money and they get on TV. And so, I mean, there's a problem with how it's being policed, and it's got to be this, grow into this really massive problem rather than treat it early when it was a tinny house and you could have referred people to, you know, some harm reduction support model, whatever. So I'm just noticing that. But anyway, so you go after this proceeds of crime money, it's huge, millions of dollars. The harms from methamphetamine are unequally distributed upon the Māori community. Give us that money. Let us have that money so that we can, you know, serve our people. And so I'm telling you that story, Julia, because that's what I think we've got to do with the COVID thing. We're coming through this phase of the COVID response, And we've got these Māori community organisations and Māori health providers who've done a fabulous job. And now give us the money, because you know what? We can help fix all that shit that was missed, all the delayed, deferred and missing. You know, that's our job. We're interested in that. Give that to us. Let us do that. That shit that you weren't doing so well before. You haven't done it at all well during COVID. Give us a shot. It's our turn to get a shot now. Come on. And so I think that's the provocation that Julie is creating. Over.
Yeah, also, you know, there will be some more money for COVID, but not as much. So when the rationing happens, who gets prioritised? Which workforce gets kept? Which, with the reduced funding, where, you know, where does it go? I think that's also something to be monitored. But yeah.
And also, how can we monitor in this process that we've learnt how to disinvest from stuff that's not pro-equity? So it's not just wanting to continue to use the COVID putia, but it's what else is not creating pro-equity is going to be a target of other aspects of the health services and outcomes kaupapa inquiry that we can utilise to do what we now have proven, or what our communities have proven works. So, you know, it's a question for you too, Julia, in the Waikato here, with some kōrero around our whānau-centred COVID response unit with our wonderful upskilled rangatahi and Pacific providers and Māori providers, allowing them to get on and carry on supporting hauora and our whānau through all sorts of other avenues of the system. So cool pātai, and looking forward to sending you the paper that we discussed this morning in our governance group. There's another pātai for you in the chat too, Rawiri, but I think there was also a hand up somewhere.
Yeah, there was a hand up on Mark Winnard's screen. It got dropped a couple of seconds ago. Did you still want to ask the question?
Kia ora, thanks Trevor, and kia ora koutou, ngā mihi nui kia koutou, and I'm just using my husband's computer because mine's broken, and there are so many questions, aren't there, and I was just probably partly making a comment and I guess asking others, the kōrero about the deficit hammering, and, you know, putting up the vax rates, and that's just another kind of deficit stat. And I think it's certainly a challenge. Sorry, my day job was as a public health physician in the kind of planning and funding part of Counties Manukau when it was a DHB, so Counties Manukau Te Whatuora district. But I have spent most of the last 2.5 years working with Rawiri and others in the Northern COVID response. And you know, the challenge we've had and we could keep having is how do we make the case for the equity gaps, for the te tiriti things that need to be addressed with our data in such a way that it is stark, it's blunt, we can call it out, but that doesn't end up in a space where our communities constantly feel like the picture that's painted of them is deficit and awful. And, you know, we've had some of our communities, because we kind of tried to say, well, you know, maybe we need to still do that gappy stuff in all our board papers and stuff, because that's how we get traction, that's how we get resource, that's how we get prioritisation. And then, but when we talk with our communities, you know, we have to do it differently and we have to turn that around. And, you know, people like Tanya Kingi, you can imagine, would challenge that and say, you can't do that because you won't turn it around. You will bleed out your deficit stuff because you always do. And so we continue to have that deficit frame about us everywhere. So I think there is a real challenge, and I'd be interested in others' thoughts about how we can. And I know, I mean, Rawiri, I remember we had a conversation at one point, we were trying to look at this outcomes framework and say, you know, what if we turned the data for each indicator on its head and said, rather than the, you know, the percentage of hapu, you know, mama hapu who are smoking, how many of them are smoke free, how many of them are, you know, the positive kind of stuff. And we looked at kind of how that picture looked, and you know, some of it was hard because it didn't tell the story with such power, but it was a less deficit framing. And I think, you know, how do we work together to do that so much better than we've done somehow? Ebony's got her hand up. She might want to pick up on some of that.
Is there a response meantime from Rawiri or Polly?
Okay. Hammer, spanner, axe. So Doon was talking about hammer and hammering, and so everybody's sort of familiar with what a hammer does, and it's you got to relentlessly bang it. You know, it could be a people hammer, so you bang people, but it could be this kaupapa hammer, and we're always going to be banging on about utility and equity, and so it's going to be really equity based, evidence based, and I get it. So, you know, sometimes I don't have a lot of tools in my toolkit. I'm just going to be really straight up with you. I've got 4. Hammer's one of them, so we've got to know how to use the hammer. And spanner, so hopefully everybody knows how to use a spanner. So, you know, this is a spanner, and you jam it into the cogs and you bring the machine to a crashing halt. So as long as everybody knows that's how to use a spanner, putting a spanner in the works. And there'll be time and place where we need, you would have seen us do it. There's sometimes, actually the last time I worked with Trevor we used a spanner. So it was during COVID, and Pharmac was going out consulting on the new diabetes drugs. And we got our big spanner out and we jammed it in there as hard as we could. And we had everybody on our case to get that spanner out. You're jamming up the works. You're going to cause harm. Those new medicines are bloody important. They're going to make a difference. And all of those Māoris over the age of 65, they're going to get those medicines. It's going to make a difference. And our spanner stays jammed in there. We go, nah, fuck it. We want an ethnicity adjuster in the criteria from Pharmac. This spanner's going nowhere. Oh man, they were upset. Every meeting I went to, cardiologists, diabetologists, renal physicians, everybody, they promised me, if we just take that spanner out, they'll help me later on, you know, bend towards equity. They'll definitely help, right? Promise we're going to help. We'll help you get there and afterwards, right? Just take your spanner out. And we refused, and we just stayed in that conversation. We worked with Trevor, and, to the credit of Pharmac, they had an ethnicity adjuster in the access criteria to those 2 new diabetes medicines. And because of that, we can tell the story now. So this is my hammer. I'll go back to my hammer. We're going to hammer away at this story. We've got to tell the stories of when we achieve really pro-equity results. And you look at the data on those new diabetes drugs, and we smashed it. We're still smashing it. We're doing a great job. That's, us, all of us in the system, we can do this. Or if you're hammering away, you'd be going, okay, well, let's have a look at the workforce. The number one thing that we've got to do in Te Ako Whai Ora is we need a nursing workforce that's sufficient, a Māori nursing workforce that's sufficient. So imagine that we're going to have thousands and thousands of Māori nurses in the next few years. We've got evidence of how to do that. Look at the med schools. They achieve demographic proportionality of entry into med school, demographic proportionality of graduation from med school. This is such a powerful thing that I can reach out to Māori Public Health, or, somebody rings me up with a complex case about cardiology. We've got cardiologists who are Māori. We've got ophthalmologists that are Māori. We've got 2 Māori hepatobiliary surgeons. We've got Māori neurologists. We've got Māori GPs. We've got, and Māori doctors are really joined up. Just imagine for a minute how amazing it's going to be when we've got thousands and thousands of Māori nurses. So, we can, the hammering away there, the equity achievements we've made, we've got to hammer away at those and tell that story. I won't go into the other 2 tools. Well, I'll just mention ACTS, because in my tribunal evidence, I inserted, it was my sense of humour, and I said it as a traditional Māori saying, if you are a big tree, we are a small axe. So axe is the other tool. Sometimes we've got to chop that down. We've got to be relentless, and a small axe can chop down a big tree. Not truly a Māori traditional saying. I'd have to give credit to, well, some of you will know who that deserves credit for that.
That would be Bob Marley.
Well, he's saying about it, but he's not the originator of the
Kia ora. Kia ora tātou. I'm mindful of the time. I think we're on the stage till 8 o'clock. Bronwyn, you had a question. I think I might give you the opportunity to be the last question asker.
Kia ora koutou, ngā mihi mai oha mō te kōrero te pōnei, ka nui te mihi kia koutou katoa. My name's Bronwyn, I'm a public health physician. Yeah, just a quick question really for Rawiri. I just wondered, Rawiri, your experience thus far of te aka whai ora, and if you're optimistic about being able to dismantle some of the racism we have in our central agencies. And I'm just mindful that, well, what I'm worried about, I guess, is that we'll have mostly Māori within te aka whai ora, and there'll be a dominance of sort of Pākehā who struggle with the literacy around equity, anti-racism, cultural safety, etc., within the other central agencies, and that will be a real barrier to progress. So I just wondered what your thoughts are on that and your reflections thus far. Kia ora.
Well, I'll answer quickly, and then I'll get all these public health colleagues to tell me how it's going in Te Whatu Ora, because you fellas work for Te Whatu Ora now. So what I guess one of the things I'm really interested in is a friend of mine, Bryn Jones, who gives me very frank and sometimes unwanted, but well-intentioned advice, and it can be really abrasive. And I love that because, you know, I think I need it sometimes. And but he wanted to challenge some of the talking and thinking and work that we're doing around anti-racism, and the conversation ended up talking about counter-racism. And so I guess there's part of me that looks at the anti-racism work that's going on, and you know, there's work to do. I've got work to do. We've all got work to do, and you know, do the work is you know, think about who did that book, How to Be an Anti-Racist? Ibram X. Kendi, and then Me and White Supremacy. You know, that there's work to be done, and I'll, you know, absolutely encourage people to do it. And anyway, so in the conversation I was having with Bryn, he got to a place where you want to talk about counter-racism. So if terrorism's a bad thing, then we have a counter-terrorism unit. So let's agree that racism's a bad thing, and we need to have a counter-racism unit. Because while everybody should do the work on anti-racism, sometimes when we find it, we're going to have to do some counter-racism work. So that would be my response. Holly?
Yeah, I'm just mindful of time as well. I think it's still a watch this space. Bronwyn, you probably have experience in the answer to your partai as well. I guess I'm trying to be optimistic, but I'm not finding a lot of sticks to use my spanner on, I guess. Yeah, I think it's let's just leave it with Rawiri's nice suggestion. I love the idea of a counter-racism unit. Perhaps that could be another public health agency in another organisation, because I'm already confused about all of the various public health agencies that we have going on. I like that one. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Polly. Maybe Stu could become that unit. Maybe we should have a discussion about that, Ngaire. You and I and Heather, perhaps. Kia ora tātou, whātai wawe mai tātou, ki te whakakapina o tātou hui mo tēnei pō, o te rā ko tōku wawata, ka tuku ngā mihi ki wā tātou kai kōrero, mo tō koutou kaha ki te toha whakaaro, ki te tō i o koutou kōrero i waihui hoki tēnei kaupapa e pāna ki o tātou, katoa, i roto nei i wā tātou nei mahi, e pāna ki te mahi hauora. Nō reira kia kōrua, kei te mihi, ki wā tātou nei kai whakarite, he mihi kauana hau kia koutou hoki, tō koutou mahi I whakatakotohia I koutou kia tau mai tātou I raro iho tēnei kaupapa. O te rā kia tātou katoa, huri noa te motu, kei te mihi ahau kia koutou hoki, o tō koutou, kia koutou e hāpai nei te kaupapa I waihui ho tēnei kaupapa. Kei te mihi, kei te tukuna mihi kia koutou katoa. He karakia whakamutunga pia. Tōhuna māhuna kei karakia tātou. Titiro iho mai rai te atua kia mātou au poronga. Whakamoimutu atu kia koe I tēnei pō. Whakamautia ki roto ki tēnā o mātou. Nā kō rero, hei awhi, hei taki, hei tohu I a mātou I roto I o mātou mahi. Mana ki tā, mai rātou e pāngi ana I te māwiwi, I te mate hoki kia tau atua no rātou ki te taumata o te oranga. Mana ki tā hoki wā tātou nei whānau, I runāki nei nā huarahi o te motu kia tai atua no rātou ki te poho wā tātou whānau. Ko te atua tō tātou kaihana, mene. Kia ora hui mai tātou, kia ora. Thank you everybody.
Kia ora.